major things I should know?
Okay, so thanks for the question. So software versus hardware. Obviously, there are fundamental differences in the way that the device presents itself to the user. But the bottom line is that the fundamentals of writing a clinical evaluation are the same. It's still necessary to meet the basic requirements in terms of the objectives of a clinical evaluation. So demonstrating suitability for intended purpose, demonstrating conformity with the relevant general safety performance requirements, demonstrating that the benefit risk profile is acceptable, and that the product performs in line with safety performance objectives. So they don't change, and in the vast majority of cases, they would still rely on clinical evidence. You can also do things with software that you can with hardware. So for example, you can claim equivalence to other products, assuming you phrase the equivalence claim properly. The biggest fundamental difference is an additional layer of evidence that's needed in many cases. What that means is that a software product will produce an outcome, and it's necessary to demonstrate that that outcome is relevant to the clinical problem. So for example, if you had an algorithm that was analyzing appearances on an MRI scan, and it was making comments on tissue density, and the idea behind the product was that differences in tissue density may be associated with a certain disease state, you would need in the clinical evaluation to close that gap and show that those differences in tissue density do in fact relate to the disease state in question. So an additional layer of evidence to link the software with the clinical condition. Otherwise, the principles are essentially the same. There is an MDCG guideline on exactly this topic, which is MDCG 2020-1, which is well worth a read through.
Thank you, Paul. Okay, had another set of questions come through via email, and there's actually 3 of them, so I'll read them out. I'll do one at a time. So the first is, please explain how to conduct clinical evaluation according to MDR article 61(10).
Okay, yeah, so 6110 is an interesting provision. What 6110 does is it allows an alternative route to demonstrate conformity, specifically for products where reliance on clinical evidence would be inappropriate. So obviously the base case is that all products need to have clinical evidence to support suitability for intended purpose and so on. But for some products, it's not that it's difficult, it's that it's actually inappropriate. So if you manufacture an oxygen pipe or gas tap or something, there's no way you can generate clinical evidence on that because it wouldn't relate to its function. Its function is entirely technical, it's delivery of a gas. So Article 6110 is designed to allow another route to conformity for products like that. The key test is that clinical evidence is inappropriate, not that it's not available. So it's not a get out for an absence of clinical data. There's several other rules to use Article 6110. One is around the nature of the interaction with the human body. And so it needs to have a low risk and usually low duration interaction with the human body. It needs to be of a risk class that's not excluded from use of Article 6110. So most class 3 devices are excluded from using that route. You need to justify why it's appropriate to use it. Again, really, that's all about the justifications to why using clinical evidence would be inappropriate. And importantly, the manufacturer is not allowed to make any clinical claims of benefits or performance claims. So everything needs to be non-clinical. And if you use Article 6110, it means that, assuming you've phrased the justification correctly, you can prove conformity just on the basis of preclinical data, so bench testing data or evidence of alignment with harmonized standards. And it is the most appropriate conformity route for a minority of devices.
Okay, great. The second question was, which chapters must the CER have and which are not applicable?
Oh, right, so I don't know whether that is in relation to 6110 or in relation to a clinical evaluation report in general. There's any number of different ways to structure a CER, but I would say there are several fundamentals which should form the basis of a well-structured CER. At Managed Systems, we use a 14-section structure. And so there's a couple of administrative sections first. Usually a good idea to set out some administrative particulars, the name of the device, the basic UDIDI, the risk classification, and the authors of the CER. Then an executive summary, which is like an abstract. It's a summary of the report that follows. Next, I would recommend an important section, scope of the clinical evaluation. This is where you set out what the device is and what hypothesis you're testing. What are you going to look at through the clinical evaluation? It's also where you set out alternatives to the subject device, similar devices, and so on. The next section I would recommend, this is in line with some of the recommendations from MDCG. This is where you should put a summary of the clinical evaluation plan. A good principle to operate by is that the CER should work as a standalone document. So you don't need to regurgitate the whole CEP, but just a summary. In particular, what's your search protocol? How are you going to find, appraise, and analyze the clinical data that you include? The next section, it's a good idea to list any relevant harmonized standards. And then the way we structure it is that section 6 is a detailed exploration of the evidence related to state of the art. This is a really critical section because this is where you get your safety and performance objectives, ideally down to single numbers for each parameter based on a weighted analysis. Section 7, the way we structure it, relates to equivalence. So this is only relevant if you're actually making a claim of equivalence. If you are in this section, you need to set it out in alignment with the recommendations in MDCG 2020-5. Following that, the clinical evidence review section, this is where you look at the evidence related to your subject device. And then in section 9, you compare the evidence for subject device with that of state of the art to show that your product is suitable for its intended purpose and it aligns with the safety and performance objectives. We deal with benefit risk profile in a separate section, that's section 10, and then section 11 is a conclusion. And then you need some other administrative sections for a record of the sources that you've excluded, references of included sources, and author CVs. So that's how we set out CER at Managed Systems.
Thank you, Paul. And the final question was, is proving equivalence with a similar device already on the market applicable to 6110?
Okay, so back with 6110. So remember, the principle of equivalence is that you're essentially going to borrow or piggyback clinical data from another device that you've shown is sufficiently similar to your own device. So the key consideration there is clinical data. And because the route to conformity under 6110 doesn't require clinical data, it requires non-clinical data, then it wouldn't normally be relevant to pursue a claim of equivalence. Now, there might be some exclusions to that because it's not just performance data, but also safety data that we need to be considering. And it might be that there's some useful safety data related to an equivalent device. But I think you're blurring lines. I think if it's Article 6110, then it should be a non-clinical route to conformity because you're saying it's inappropriate to use clinical data. So it wouldn't normally be relevant to 6110. Just as an aside, using Article 6110, though, does not remove the obligation to collect PMCF data on the product. Okay, great. I've had a few more questions in the chat, but some others came in via email, so we'll go cover those first. If I have a tight deadline to write a CER, how do you recommend I organize things for maximum efficiency? Yeah, so this is something that we do a fair amount of as clients approach us with tight deadlines. It goes back to basic principles of doing a clinical evaluation. The first golden rule, which we always adhere to, is it's a much bigger job than you think. So you're going to need a team of people if you have a tight deadline to do this properly. And the reason for that is that it's going to be necessary to run several different streams of work in parallel. The piece which normally takes the most time is the state-of-the-art literature review. I say normally because sometimes there are comparatively few relevant sources, but that's the exception. Oftentimes, this is where you'll need the largest number of people and need to spend the greatest amount of time. So I recommend making a start on the SOTA review as early as possible. You can then start populating the other sections, such as section 3, which we talked about before, which is principally in relation to information about the device itself, while the CER review is underway. You can also, while the CER review is underway, start collating data relating to the subject device. And so you can do a literature review for the subject device. You can go to the vigilance databases, the adverse events databases like BOARD, and start collating data so that by the time the CER review finishes, you've got everything in place to make your comparison. But I think the basic principle would be start with the most time-consuming sections first, if possible, and have a team of people working in parallel.
Thank you, Paul. So some questions are in the chat, actually. Actually comes back to, well, it's Article 61, so I'll just read this out. Does the state of the art considered as a clinical data when included to demonstrate the conformity under Article 1, Section 10? Do you follow that?
So I think the question is, essentially, can you use state-of-the-art data to demonstrate conformity of the subject device? If that is the question, the answer is no. So there's only two sources of evidence that can demonstrate conformity. That's clinical evidence on the subject device itself or clinical evidence on an equivalent device. So if you've got data in the state of the art that you wish you could use for your device, the first question is that device equivalent? If the answer is no, then technically speaking, you can't use it to support conformity. You can use it, you can't use it as a basis of conformity, but you can use it to kind of round off the circle at the end. But the primary requirement is that you've got data on your device or an equivalent device. There are one or two potential exceptions to that in very, very limited cases. One might be if you're using a software algorithm in an unchanged manner for the same specific purpose as it's been used elsewhere. In theory, given the same input, that can only ever produce the same output. So you may be able to use data related to that algorithm if it's been used elsewhere. But that would pose the question, why not just use an equivalence claim? So fundamentally, it's subject device data or equivalence device data that you need to use.
Thank you, Paul. And yeah, we have another question from Nadia about equivalence. It's a general, what are the conditions to claim equivalence under the MDR, which I think you've covered, but I don't know if you have anything more to add on that.
No, I mean, it's worth exploring that because it's an important topic. I mean, the bar has been raised under the MDR for claiming equivalence. It's harder than it used to be. The fundamental reason for that was that the regulators were unhappy about a situation where in the regulatory documentation, manufacturers were saying our device is basically exactly the same as our competitor's device, but in the marketing material, we're making claims that it's really novel and really different. So those two things aren't in line with one another. So to claim equivalence successfully under MDR, the first step is to make sure that you meet the baseline requirements. So by that, I mean that if you look at the regulation, if you have a class 3 device, you need a contract in place with the manufacturer of the equivalent device, showing that you have full unfettered access to the technical files. That's not a problem if you're claiming equivalence to your own device, but I fail to foresee a universe in which a competitor would give you access to the technical files. So in that situation, to all intents and purposes, it is now impossible to claim equivalence for that reason. Assuming you can demonstrate you have sufficient access to data and you don't need a contract, or that you have a contract, then it's just a case of looking at the three types of characteristics that you need to consider: technical characteristics, biological characteristics, and clinical characteristics. And you need to be equivalent in all of these. And of course, under those headings, there'd be a number of line items depending on the type of device. So if it was software, there may not be any biological considerations because it may not have any. Sorry, I'm just seeing a question from Nadia saying she can't hear anything. That may not have any physical contact with the patient. But for hardware devices, all three sets of characteristics will be significant. So you need to list them. And really what you're doing is making a comparison between the subject device and the equivalent device, and then making a comment on the likely impact of any differences on safety and performance for each line item. And it's not that there can't be any differences, it's that there needs to be a scientific rationale for why those differences won't affect safety or performance. And so they don't need to be identical, but you need to be able to justify the non-significance of any differences. And then at the end, you form a conclusion, which ideally should show alignment with the requirements. And the best source is 2020-5, MDCG 2020-5, which sets out the MDR requirements really for equivalence.
Thank you, Paul. It's a shame because Nadia asked the question. I think she's having technical problems. So hopefully that was useful for other people on the call. We have another question that came in via email, fairly similar. Can I use MDR Article 6110 if I don't have any clinical evidence for my medical device?
Yeah, yes. I mean, it's tempting, isn't it? But remember what I said before. Article 6110 is for situations in which using clinical evidence would be inappropriate, not where it's absent. And to be honest, Article 6110 should be considered an edge case. It's not advisable to use that as a route to conformity if you can avoid it, because the regulators will automatically be on notice if somebody presents a 6110 conformity route. But no, if you have a device which doesn't really neatly fit those criteria we talked about before, then it's a case of accumulating clinical data, really.
Thank you, Paul. And another question in the chat: how do we conclude on the risk and benefit ratio when clinical data is not deemed appropriate?
Yeah. Okay. So. It's a good question, actually. So I suppose the baseline position is that neither benefits nor risks need to be strictly clinical. So in a 6110 case, for example, it's actually a requirement that you're not making any claims of clinical benefit. Clinical benefits, just as an aside, are those that lead to an improvement in the state of health of an individual or the quality of the provision of care. That's just an approximate way to think about it. So again, if you go back to a gas tap, that doesn't have any direct clinical benefit. It doesn't do anything unless it's attached to a delivery pipe and an oxygen mask, and that the patient needs it and that it's been prescribed appropriately. There's so many steps between the gas tap, which is an inert piece of apparatus that doesn't actually do a lot on its own from a clinical perspective. So probably the risk analysis will be mostly in relation to non-clinical risks. So again, to extrapolate this example, perhaps fire, the risk of fire would be a risk. And then the benefits would similarly be technical. So really it's just showing that the risks are all acceptable according to risk evaluation criteria within the risk management files. And in that case, really, if the risks are acceptable, there's no requirement to demonstrate clinical benefit, but showing alignment with relevant harmonized standards in that case will be a surrogate for clinical benefits, because if you're aligning with those standards, it suggests that the apparatus is functioning as it should be according to internationally agreed rules. So that's how you would approach benefit risk profile if you're using 6110.
Thank you, Paul. Another question that came in via email. Do I really need to account for all the excluded literature sources?
Yes. The answer is yes, you do. So the reason for that is that if you don't account for all the excluded sources, then you're not able to demonstrate that you haven't been selective in the ones that you've included. In other words, have you just picked those that make life easier or show your device in a better light? I'm not suggesting anybody on this call would actually do that, but that's the thought process of a reviewer. So you need a good, effective, efficient process for recording and justifying your exclusions. It really begins with research questions and search terms. Make sure the research questions are appropriately structured, ideally using a framework like PICO, and then that your search terms are fed by those research questions and are reasonably well defined without being too restrictive. So one principle to bear in mind is that the databases such as PubMed will function according to the words that are actually written in the literature sources. So if you're too restrictive with that, you could end up accidentally excluding sources that you would otherwise want to include. But yeah, so you need well-selected search terms fed by appropriate research questions. And then you need an efficient process for actually screening and recording exclusions. So at Mantra Systems, we use a codified system. And so, for example, our code E1 relates to a duplicate article. And so if you record your the outputs of your literature searches in a spreadsheet software like Google Sheets or Excel, a lot of them can be excluded on the basis of the title. If it's obviously unrelated, you'd see that on a quick review of the title and you could just insert the number code next to it. And then that's how you can keep an effective record of all excluded sources. But it is a big job. It does take a long time. It takes some thought process. And so the better constructed your search terms, the more efficient the exclusion recording is.
Thank you, Paul. Just to let everyone know that they can ask questions in the chat. We've got a bit more time, but we did have another one come through on the email. And this is, do I need a CER even if my devices are all class 1?
Yeah, this is a common inquiry that we get, to be honest. The answer is yes, you do. All devices of all types need a clinical evaluation, and that's under both the UK MDR and the EU MDR. And the difference, of course, is that with the exception of subtypes of class 1, such as sterile, reusable surgical devices or class 1 devices with a measuring function, with the exception of those, a class 1 CER will not need to be submitted to a notified body or an approved body. So you might think, well, why do we need it in the first place? Well, of course, the competent authority, when you sign a declaration of conformity, you're telling the competent authority that you're in alignment with the requirements. And also, as a component of surveillance of the medical device market in their territory, a competent authority may actually request access to the technical files at any time. There's really nothing to gain from not being in alignment with the requirements. So yes, you do need a clinical evaluation, even if your device is a class 1. That said, it doesn't have to go into the same level of detail as if it's a class 3, but it's still a big, significant piece of work that needs to be done properly. And if done properly, actually has significant benefits beyond just ticking a box. Because as we'll talk about in a seminar we're hosting next week, the benefits of doing this properly mean that you can put greater weight and emphasis, evidence-based emphasis behind sales and marketing messaging. You've done a really thorough analysis of competitor devices from an evidence perspective through your state-of-the-art review. It can give you really good insight into areas where your device might be performing better than your competitors. You might have lower rates of adverse events, for example, or greater reduction in pain, or whatever it would be. So it's a powerful process when done properly and handled well, that's worth thinking about beyond it being a box ticking exercise. But the short answer is yes, you do.
Thank you, Paul. And another question has come through on chat. I think we'll have time for this one. How would you identify applicable clinical performance outcomes for an imaging software that shall be an aid for a diagnostic procedure?
Okay, so as with many such questions, the answer to this is through the state-of-the-art literature review. So you might say, well, my device is completely novel, there's nothing else like it out there, there's no point doing a state-of-the-art review because it always relates to something completely different. The fact of the matter is, the state-of-the-art review, if done properly, will tell you what people are currently recording when addressing this clinical problem. And that's your start point for what clinical parameters you need to focus on and what would be the most appropriate for a performance criterion. So it's not really for us to tell the literature what we expect to find, it's for the literature to tell us and for us to respond to that. So then we can honestly say that the process has been evidence-based right from the start. That goes back again to research question and search term selection, and not been too directive in terms of what you put into the search terms, because if you are, you'll exclude perhaps some outcome parameters that would have been the most appropriate for a performance objective.
Thank you again, Paul. So I think we're coming up to the half-hour mark, and that's perfect timing. All the questions that have come in have been asked, and there aren't any more coming in that I can see. So I think that's a great time to end the call. But just before we go, we'll just like to say that we periodically run these CER clinics, and the best way to be informed of when the next one is going to be, to give you the opportunity to ask, is to subscribe to our newsletter, and you'll be given some email notifications when that occurs. That newsletter is link to the newsletter is in the chat now, and I'll just hand back over to Paul if he has anything other to say about our other webinars or any of our news updates or templates.
Yeah, thanks, Rich. So it's just to say thanks everybody for joining. Do appreciate your time. This is a really big, complex area, clinical evaluation. We can only get to the tip of the iceberg on a call like this, but we're here to help. We're more than happy to have open conversations. Don't feel like you're going to be forced into a sales channel. We just don't function that way. So if you have questions, you want to reach out to us, then please do so, either through our LinkedIn page or using contact@mantrasystems.com, or just email Rich or I directly. Subscribe to the newsletter so we can keep in touch with you. We do offer a range of different services. We do a full clinical evaluation service from start to finish, where we handle everything for you. We also offer a range of templates, so clinical evaluation plan, clinical evaluation report templates that are available through the Enable CE section of our website. That's worth exploring if you prefer to do things yourself. But do reach out if you need any more information, and hopefully we can speak again. So thanks again, everybody, for joining. And I think we can probably close the call at that point.
Yes, thank you, Paul. Okay, great. Thank you, everyone, for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you next time.
Thanks, everyone.